And good morning, everybody. Welcome to FSU Coach Live. My name is Tim Baghurst, and today I'm joined by special guest Matthew Sparks. He's a high-performance coach for Cirque du Soleil. Matthew, thank you so much for joining me. If you wouldn't mind, Cirque du Soleil is an interesting area, and I think a lot of people probably don't know too much about it and high-performance coaching in it. So if you wouldn't mind, just give us a little bit of your history and how you got even into a profession like that. Uh-oh, I can't hear you. You're muted. Okay, try again.
Was I muted there?
Yeah, we're good now.
Okay. So, as you said, I work for Cirque du Soleil. I've been with Cirque for my 21st year with the company, so it's a pretty long run. My job with the circus, I'm the senior advisor of coaching and performance content, senior head coach, and a acrobatic performance designer. So I will also work on new creations and deal with that as well as our shows that are out in operation. And before Cirque, I was also coaching. I came from the world of dance and gymnastics. I was the Canadian national team coach for artistic gymnastics up until the 1999 World Championships. From there, we were trying to qualify a full team to the 2000 Olympic Games. We failed to do so. Only the top 12 countries in the world qualified a team to go to the Olympics. So I was at a crossroads. Do I continue to do this for the next 4 years, trying to, again for the next Olympic cycle? Or do I run away and join the circus? And that's sort of what happened. A friend of mine, Boris Verkovsky, the Cirque du Soleil was a much smaller company at that time. And an old friend of mine, Boris Verkovsky, was the head coach of the circus. The company really only had one head coach at that time, but the company was expanding. There were a half dozen shows. By the time we closed due to COVID, we had 44 shows. So in those years, we went from about 6 shows to 44. And Boris was looking for somebody to join one of our shows as a head coach. That show was on European tour at the time. It was a show called Kidam. And so Boris sort of called me up and said, are you doing this for another 4 years? Are you going for another Olympic cycle? Or do you want to run away, join the circus, go to Europe, and go from city to city? He sent me a copy of what the tour schedule looked like. And I was like, wow, 6 weeks in London, 6 weeks in Barcelona. It just all looked fun and romantic. So I ran away and did that. That's what led me to the circus. Now, after 20 years, I did a European tour with the company. I did a North American tour, Asia Pacific tour, went to our resident show division, managed shows in operation on our resident shows, and then ultimately went into this sort of senior management position that I'm in now, and still straddle back to creating new shows, new creations, where I'll step in as a performance designer. So that's the story.
You were a gymnastics coach. Does that mean that you grew up in gymnastics? Is that what you were as an athlete?
Yeah, I was a gymnast and a dancer. And then I became a gymnastics coach and ultimately a gymnastics judge. I was what they call a FIG brevet judge. So I was certified to judge Olympic Games, World Championships. So yeah, I did sort of the full game from athlete to coach, judge, and then ran away into the circus.
If you're just joining us, we're talking with Matthew Sparks. If you have a question for him, just put it in your chat box and we'll get it to him during this conversation. When you and I both met, it was at an international sport coaching conference, and you were one of the keynote speakers. And it was fascinating to me that you were coming in from essentially an artistic show component and providing expert advice and education on high performance. Now, when I think about Cirque du Soleil or any of these kinds of shows, the automatic thing is it's a show. It's not a competition. Therefore, why is high performance really involved in this? So rather than me trying to explain that, what goes on in high performance? Why do these artists / athletes have to have this high performance training?
So first, I'll back up to exactly where we met, which was in Tokyo at the ICCE conference. I go to conferences like that because I'm trying as best as I can to think of best practices and really next practices for Cirque du Soleil. So I have the opportunity to go to these conferences because people are interested in what we're doing, but I'm there to steal ideas and bring them back to our environment. And one of these conferences leads to the other. So I had the opportunity to go to the one in Tokyo, which led to me doing another one with Premier League just shortly after that because of people that I met there. And for each one of these things, I'm super honored, right? The Premier League, it was the Elite Head of Coaching Conference. So I'm sitting here with all these great minds, and I speak for 90 minutes at the end of the conference, but I'm there for days beforehand going, oh, I'll take a note on that. Oh, that's really good. I'm going to bring that back to our environment. So the more I do that sort of thing, the more I realize high performance is high performance. And it doesn't matter from one sport to another sport, you're able to go, okay, I can see all these parallels, but also from high performance entertainment. And by high performance entertainment, we're really athletes. We call our athletes artists, but they are athletes. So the jump from what we do to high performance sport, it's actually not that hard to make. Now, you mentioned the artistic nature of what we do. That's tough. The reason that is tough for us is we don't have a score, right? If your sport's racquetball, if you stink it up in racquetball, you know, because there's a very objective result that you get at the end. There's a score. You win, you lose, you move on, you don't. But what happens to our artists at the end of the night is sometimes they'll get a standing ovation. Everybody stands up and applauds. But our artists might have done a sub-maximum performance, and we would know it inside. So we started looking for how are we going to do this? How are we going to take some of the subjectivity out of what we do and bring back some sort of laudably objective result? And we piggybacked a little bit on maybe what's done in some of the artistic sports. There's a guy named Hardy Fink. Hardy was involved in the International Gymnastics Federation for many years. And he brought up a notion about gymnastics judging, that it's almost a miracle that the sum of subjective evaluations can bring a laudably objective result. But we didn't have anybody giving us any sort of evaluation at all, other than the audience. And you get these things called NPS scores that sort of give you an idea of the audience appreciation. But what we tried to do and what we implemented several years ago, brought on by one of our brilliant head coaches, Joanne Julina, she brought in the idea of a peer review show assessment. So that idea was we did have this panel of experts working for the company, but they were all out over these many, dozens of different shows all around the world. We started getting our experts, our head coaches, each of our different shows, to evaluate the other shows. And so they would do a review of their peers, and they would look at every act in every show that would be assigned to evaluate, and they would look at it under four major headlines or criteria. They would look at the technical level of the skills being performed in an act. They would look at what we call the acro-artistic blend. So that's the idea that for us, just doing the acrobatic skill alone, if you're just going to see the acrobatic skill alone, you might as well go watch a diving competition or a gymnastics competition. There had to be a blending of the acro and artistic together, so they would evaluate that content. They would evaluate the rhythm and pacing of the act, so maybe that has to do with the structure of the act. Sort of if you were thinking of it that way, maybe you think of in a three-act structure, everything has to have a beginning and a middle and an end and storytelling. So how is the rhythm and pacing of the act? And they'd look at the staging of the act. So staging would be if you had a plate and I stuck my finger at the bottom of the plate and saw how it was balanced. How did the plate balance? Does it visually look good? How is the lighting? Or did you involve characters into the act? So costuming, all of those things could be part of staging. So our coaches would evaluate in four different criteria, and then that would give you sort of a numerical value for that act's appreciation. Anything a coach evaluated very low, they were asked to give feedback on. So maybe a suggestion, hey, have you thought about this? Hey, this could be better. So that there was some sort of, because often I've been a coach at a show and I've known that an act needed improvement, but I haven't been able to find the inspiration or the spark or idea. So maybe they would come with some concrete suggestions in that peer review show assessment to help trigger a thought in that show's head coach. And then you have a result of every act in the show. So you can graph the rhythm and pacing of the show as a whole. So if you think of one of our touring shows, they have an intermission in the middle. The ideal rhythm and pacing should sort of look like a W. So you want the show to start at a big wow, get the audience in. You can get a little bit more poetic and storytelling through the middle. But as you lead to the intermission, you want to be again at a high point so that people go into the intermission with that enthusiasm. They come back in there, you can get back into poetic and storytelling, but you have to finish the W. It better finish with a wow, right? So now you're able to take a look at the numbers and go, how are we actually doing? A panel of experts looked at this, and are our wows in the show at the right place? So we can get that from a peer review show assessment. It became a very valuable tool also, where acts inside the show could get competitive with one another. If you're getting an ovation every night, maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe you want to be the best act in the show. Or we can also then see all of our shows, how they rank. What's the strongest show in all of the company? So here's the number one show. This is the show that our panel of experts, our coaches, all said this is the best show in the company. Once you put all of those subjective opinions together, they agreed, and now you actually have a ranking. And so a show can go, we're number one, and a show that's number 8 can go, oh my God. Next peer review show assessment, it's an annual process. But by next year's PRSA, peer review show assessment, we got to get better than that show. We want to be number one. Right, we want to move ourselves up in that ranking because there was a little bit of some bragging rights to that. Sure. So somehow we took this, getting that winning feeling every night to a little dose of reality and maybe being able to get a little bit of a competitive spark into a non-competitive environment.
It's interesting because here you are, you're a large organization.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, you're a large organization, and you have this pretty intricate system for evaluating shows and evaluating coaches, but yet a lot of sports organizations don't have this system in place, and it's just based on winning and losing. Whereas, or in your case, it would be how loud is the clapping at the end? If the clapping is loud, it must have been a good show. Your understanding that doesn't necessarily mean success. They may just be a polite crowd or whatever reason. When you look at bringing in athletes into this equation, and I'm going to call them athletes, and I'm going to ask you to debate, are they athletes or artists? Who do you recruit to be in your shows? Are they people who've come through sports, or are they people who've come through, as you talked about, being in dance or something else?
So I don't think I can really separate whether they're athletes or artists. We need to have artists on stage. Some of those will start as athletes. Okay. So the idea is that we might bring an athlete in, but we'll put them through some sort of formation, a performance preparation program, ideally, where they will learn the art of being on stage and hopefully start to understand that. I did an interview not long ago for a potential coach for us who was one of our former artists, but like a legendary artist for us, a guy named Dave Labelle. And he was, I had the opportunity to work with him when he was an artist, and he inspired me. I was the coach, and the guy inspired me. He was special. But he had a very interesting answer to some of the questions in the interview that stuck with me on artistry. And one of the things was he didn't care whether somebody did a triple back. He wanted to see that they were excited or nervous before they went, and that they were elated when they finished. And so that, as an audience member, meant more to him, because an audience often can't see if somebody does a double twisting double layout or a triple twisting double layout. An acrobatic expert might, but for the audience, they can feel emotion, and that goes the emotion of what our artists feel. This is huge. We'll often say things like, if you don't feel anything on stage, the audience won't feel anything. And so it's about making an emotional connection with the audience. So then our artists get very good at finding real and true emotion and displaying that and being in the moment when they're on stage. So even though they do the same performance hundreds of times, the emotion that they're feeling needs to be real and genuine, and they have to be living the moment. That actually, it spins into something that I think is very important from sport that I wish I had known in sport. I would, if I go back and was a sport coach again, I would have my athletes do acting class because there's something really important there for performance under pressure and emotional control. I don't know, Jeff, do you want me to get into that a little bit? What I think about that one?
I'm curious, and it was actually a question I was going to ask: is do you think that athletes need to learn a little bit better how to almost put on a show, maybe for their own performance, but also on the understanding that sport is very much entertainment, and if you're entertaining, people want to watch you. If people watch you, you're able to raise sponsors and all these things. So yeah, let's go into that a little bit and explain what you mean.
Okay, so if you think about performance under pressure, which is sort of a catchword and a buzz phrase, and I've done a few camps with Red Bull that were called performance under pressure, sort of become like a buzz line. So if you think about what performance under pressure is, it's sort of the ability to suppress emotions and stress and still make good decisions. So if we can accept first, if we can accept that that's a definition of what it means to perform under pressure, that's sort of where coaching gets into it. And what I've witnessed as we prepare for pinnacle events, pretty much everybody that's getting ready for a pinnacle event has high level coaching expertise, probably a integrated services team that's helping them prepare for the event. Everybody knows periodization and peaking. Like there's not a lot of stuff that's new there. So who does their best at the pinnacle moment? What causes somebody to succeed and fail? And I think often you can go, it has to do with an emotional breakdown. Something happens where they don't perform at their best at that moment because they can't control their emotions or the stress. And we're all going to feel stress at that time at a pinnacle event. They're all going to feel an emotion. So it has to do with whether or not they were able to control that. So then it's, well, can you control emotions? I think you can. A lot of people have written on it. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talked about the ability to control and suppress emotions. We normally think of him for the flow channel, but he's actually spoken quite a bit on that. There was a guy named Paul Ekman, I think. There was a TV show based on his theories called Lie to Me. And I don't buy into everything he says, but it's about universal facial expressions and the idea that sort of if you smile, but you really smile, it's not just in your face, but if you can engage the small muscles around your eyes, you get that little crinkle around your eyes, and you actually genuinely smile, there's a positive impact on your emotional state. Right? So you're sort of, if you pretend to feel good by putting on a smile and you're able to do it, engage all the right muscles, that there is a positive feeling. It's been attributed maybe to somatic marker theory or somatic marker hypothesis, but that's not my area, so I'm not going to speak about it. Now I'm talking about my personal belief on things I've witnessed on shows. But the artists who are able to feel those genuine emotions, and they get very, very good at it, right? Because they do hundreds of shows a year. We have artists that perform 500 times a year, and each time practicing controlling their emotions, which is 500 times, right? It's amazing. You think about, 3 times as much as Major League Baseball when it's existing, right? But huge numbers of shows compared to games. So they're very accustomed to getting themselves into this appropriate emotional state for what they're going to present to the audience. And they learn to become very, very good at getting into the right state of mind at the moment. Sometimes you're sitting backstage and you're watching people playing chess or backgammon 5 minutes before they're to go on, and they can turn a switch and get ready to go on stage because they've learned to perform under pressure so well. And a lot of that has to do with acting class. we'll do acting classes where they'll have to laugh, now cry, and go back and forth between laughing and crying. Make it real. I don't believe your laughter. Find it. Make it real. Okay, now it's real, and I can really see you're laughing. And you can see a moment where they're pretending to laugh, and they get just a little further, and now they're able to make the laughter genuine. And the audience almost starts to laugh with them because it becomes infectious, and you can see it. And as soon as they get there, you go, cry. And then they have to change their emotion and find sadness. Find it. What makes you sad? And learning to cycle back and forth between these things. You can ask questions like, okay, show me fear. Show me 1 out of 10 fear. Now show me 3. Show me 7. Show me 8. Your panic. Show it. Make it real. And you challenge people. Make it real. Make it real. Find it. And people can find, and you can really see when they're there. Now, okay, show me 7. Show me 5. Show me 3. And they learn the cycle and act. This thing happens in acting class frequently. Show me real emotion, bring it back down. If an athlete can learn that as a tool, I go back to that World Championships. I started this at 1999 World Championships and preparing athletes for international competition. Times when we failed, we probably could have won. We had skills, we were as good as other countries, and yet we didn't succeed. Why? Well, because we didn't perform our best when the chips were down. And I think it has to do with you're letting your emotions get away from you. And there's a huge value, I think, in acting class, and we would call it jeu, in being able to learn how to control your own emotions and taking that to a pinnacle event. Doesn't mean you're going to win, but at least you're more likely to do your best at that time. And if that's good enough, then maybe you walk away with a better result.
It's really interesting, and one of the things that I see with working with athletes and even coaches is when we look at the mental side of performance, right? The sports psychology. A lot of athletes and coaches think that it's a quick fix. It's something that you can just learn in a 1-day clinic, and I'm going to go away and be mentally tough or control my emotions. But when you work with your artists, athletes in Cirque, I mean, we're talking about weeks and weeks and then months of training in order to do this, where, I mean, I remember you describing it, where it's very intense. So in order for this to work with athletes need to understand, and coaches, that this isn't just this kind of, oh, here's a quick tip, you're going to be good. You need a lot of practice to really get this right.
Absolutely. So it's saying me making a bold recommendation like, hey, maybe in sports you should be doing acting class. A 1-day acting class is not going to make you a master of controlling your emotions. This has to do with our artists investing a conscious choice in exerting power of will over their emotions and doing it hundreds of times a year to get to a point where you get to those. The new artists are not the ones who are sitting playing backgammon backstage. They're feeling more anxiety towards their performance. It's with time and conscious effort that our artists, experienced artists, are at that level of comfort with their own performance. And you mentioned about we have a coaching education pathway that we sort of try and, I mean, that's a whole other story, but in terms of our mental, we have modules that we try and present to our developing coaches, and we have ones on mental performance. And it is my job to try and compile these modules, and I'm not an expert on mental performance. So one of the things that we do, and the reason you and I met is I go out to these sporting events and meet people. For our mental performance, we had a guy named Dave Hadfield who works with New Zealand Rugby. He wrote, and if you think of rugby, that doesn't sound like the circus world at all. It's the modules that we 3 modules prepared to help our coaches even begin to understand mental performance, even just to understand it. And we had Dave Hadfield from New Zealand Rugby write them for us, not somebody from inside of the circus world. So it's a huge thing for us, and that sort of reminds me of why I go to these events, is because if we just keep looking at our own belly button, we'd never move forward, and we're in a very competitive world in the circus. So we can't just stay where we are. We need Dave Hatfield to write our mental performance. We need these outside experts to help us elevate ourselves and move forward.
When you look at somebody doing a performance, and you mentioned up to 500 a year, which is just like hard
Yeah.
to even conceptualize. These performers have to perform the skills that they have right every time. It's not a case of where you can have bad nights off or just take a night off. In athletics, if I'm a basketball player, maybe I don't have a good night. Somebody else steps up and performs and is more accurate than me or more athletic than
Yeah.
me. It doesn't work like that in performances like yours. They have to perform the same way consistently with, as you said, genuine feeling every night. Otherwise, it becomes quite obvious.
To a certain extent, but we are able to cycle things a little bit.
Okay.
If we have an act that requires 6 people to perform a whole act, there's probably 8 people in that act. And we don't rotate any of them out. None of them have the night off, but we do cycle the work that they do. So let's say there's a big trick that finishes the number, doesn't matter what it is, it's a triple back or a widget, whatever we call that final trick of the act. The same person isn't probably going to perform it 500 times a year. So we're going to cycle that workload a little bit. We track, just to show you some of the parallels between us and sports, we follow and track a acute to chronic workload ratio on a dashboard. So we do sort of have an idea of the workload that people are doing, and we try not to hold them up at a really high acute to chronic workload ratio week after week after week. It's generally not a pinnacle event for us unless it's a premiere. It's if we see that somebody's being overworked, we can spread that work out, give it to Tim's going to do it this week, not Matthew, or for this show at least. So we do spread out the workload. So I don't want to misrepresent it and say we do the same thing 500 times a year, because it would be not honest. Our guys aren't performing at 100% of their maximum 500 times a year. No one would survive that. It's often a sub-maximal performance with maximal performance interwoven into that, if that makes sense.
It does, but at the same time, these performers, there's a lot of what they do can cause injury, a lot of stress on the body, especially over many years. Periodizing, as you kind of talked about, helps with that. How do you help those athletes who maybe go through a performance and have an acute injury? They're out for 3 months with some kind of torn tendon or something like that. How do you help them recover and come back with the confidence that they can perform those routines again?
So we do have, of course, a return to stage protocol, which would be sort of like a return to play protocol. And the coaches aren't alone in managing this. We have an IST, an integrated services team, that includes a performance medicine staff that really helps with us. We're fortunate that acute injuries are fairly rare for us. It's often that insidious onset of injury, which still might lead to somebody being out of the show, still could have long-term effects. But acute injuries are relatively rare. Of course, risk is there. We mitigate risk, we never eliminate risk. So this does happen, and sometimes we even have career-ending injuries. So this is a problem for us. One of the issues that we have is, we're talking about workload and the idea that sudden spikes in workload, Tim Gavitt's stuff with the chronic workload ratio, a sudden spike in workload is probably as likely to lead to injury as, maybe more likely to lead to injury than an acute injury. So that's one of our problems is, let's say you and I are in an act together and I get hurt. I'm out of the show. I'm now under the care of our performance medicine staff, and I might be out for months. I mean, let's say I tore my ACL. This could be a while before I go back, and a while before I can trust myself to actually perform on that knee again, right? So for the moment, I'm going to be out of the show under the care of our performance medicine team. Coaching may have a role in maintaining my fitness while I'm doing my rehab. Team Ed's going to be working on movement dysfunction and trying to get me back to where I need to be. But while I'm out of the show, you're experiencing a spike, because the work that I used to do in the show from the audience perspective should still look the same. So that means you have to pick up some of my work. Right. One of the images that I used to do, maybe it's my week to do a triple. It was your week last week. I'm out this week. So now you are having to do that triple for your week and my week. And it's so the workload sort of increases. We can bring in a temporary replacement. We have a really robust casting team that looks all around the world for talent, and we can potentially bring in somebody to replace me on a 6-month contract. Here's the problem. If we do that, when you bring me in, I'm green. Even if I was a heck of an athlete, I need to be integrated into your act, which means that you now need to come to additional trainings to help prepare me to be on stage to help you. So I will be able to take that triple from you. You're taking Matthew's triple, but now this new Matthew comes on a temporary basis, and before he can help you and take some of that workload from you, you have to actually come in more to help integrate that guy onto the team. So your workload takes a blip up because one guy gets hurt, and now another increase in your workload because you have to train the new guy. So there does become a choice that has to be made on at what point do you even ask for help? Because maybe you go, okay, if it's an ACL and the guy's out for 6 months, 9 months, who knows before he's back to full. Maybe it's worth spending a month at that increased workload to get the new guy in. But if it's a smaller thing, maybe a torn meniscus or something smaller, you start weighing it out. How long is it going to be before this guy's back? And is it better that I sustain? Can I sustain this blip in my workload, and maybe that becomes my new baseline for these next months if we can spread it out amongst the team and build up the tolerance to it? Do I do that, or do we go for that extra blip under the short term and take a risk to try and get somebody out, somebody to help in for the longer term? So there's a big decision making that has to be done by the coaching staff on when do you bring in help.
You've been all over the world and been involved in sports, and then obviously in the circus, you've seen uh, all these clinics and you've attended all these presentations. And I'm curious what you've learned from this that you think that sports needs to maybe adopt or adapt. You talked a little bit about the importance of going to acting school and learning to control those emotions. From a coaching perspective, though, given that a lot of people who watch this are going to either be coaches or want to be coaches, where do we need to go as a profession that you've seen?
I would say we have to make sure that we continue to find opportunities to play and create. And that's something that we have had, again, to 500 shows a year that we do in the circus. It's easy to get stuck in the performance zone, right? Where night after night, you have to be ready to do what you can do. And it's a high stakes environment. There's an audience where there's little opportunity to fail. We can't fall on your face. So let's at least try not to, right? So you can't take a lot of risk in your performance. So that idea of the learning zone, we don't have an off season. So when are we going to find that opportunity to spend time in the learning zone? And we've managed to do that at the circus. Right? It's a super important thing to do. We'll sometimes we'll set off days of the week where we'll go, okay, it's Sandbox Thursday. And Sandbox Thursday is playtime, and you can do anything you want at Sandbox Thursday, but it can't be something that's in the show. Or maybe it's Sunday Fun Day. So we're finding opportunities for our artists to continue to play and create despite this rigorous show schedule. And we don't have an off season to do that. So we've made it happen all the time because it's become part of our, we talked about the word culture earlier today before we got online, but it's become part of our culture, that idea of playing and creating. And we've had new acts and new disciplines get created because we've given our artists the opportunity to play backstage. I think in sport, you should keep that sense of play and creativity, because even if you think of a learning continuum, the ultimate end goal is creative variation, or that high expert can create on the fly. So that's something that we have managed to continue to encourage in the circus, and something I would definitely take back to sport and even find a place for it during season, playing and creativity.
Yeah, I like to term it, and I don't think I'm the first to term it this, but deliberate play. And the reason I say deliberate is because you need to build it in deliberately rather than, oh, we can't practice this evening the way we're going to, therefore let's do something else. But let's build this into the process of our training so that it's intentional rather than haphazard and maybe we'll get to it.
Yeah, I think experts think of that like a continuum from novice to experts. Experts have that ability to play and create, and somehow we need to foster and teach our novices to not. They're of course reliant on maybe some just direct instruction when they're a novice, but how do we prepare them to be able to play, create, to find their own path, their own style? That's what an expert looks like. So I love that deliberate play.
Thinking then, switching it to coaching, you oversee a lot of coaches, you evaluate coaches in the circus, you've seen a lot of coaching across sports. Where's the direction for kind of coach development? What do you think coaches need to be more cognizant about? What do they need to learn in order to be more effective in sports in general?
Okay, you talked about coach development. Earlier, I mentioned that we have a coaching pathway, and we have sort of developed that over the last several years. We didn't have one before. And by what I mean by coaching pathway is we did a survey in 2016 of all of our head coaches, and we found that about 40% of our head coaches were former Cirque du Soleil artists, which actually disappointed us. We felt that we did the survey because we suspected that was the result, looking at it anecdotally. So we actually did the survey and said, let's find out our number.
Well, I'm impressed you did research, by the way. I'm just going to say, a lot of organizations don't. They don't think that way, and it's more anecdotal. So I think that's
well, it started with the
out.
suspicion. Yeah. And once we found that, we went, okay, that's sort of a bit of a failing on our part, because we felt that we had great talent. We had, at the time we closed for COVID, pushing 2,000, 1,700 artists performing in the company. A lot of people. So there's talent. There had to be talent there. There had to be leadership potential there. And we had what we called captains. Captains were team leaders. Let's say I'm the head coach of a show. It's sort of like being the head coach of multiple different professional sports. So it's not like I just had a hockey team that I was coaching. If I'm coaching a team, if you watch a Cirque du Soleil show, it's like a 5-minute hockey game, then a 5-minute football game, then a 5-minute racquetball game, because it's all different areas of expertise. So as the head coach of a show, I can't possibly be think of different coactives, technical. I can't possibly be a technical world top expert on all of these different things that are happening there. So what I would do is I would piggyback on somebody that we'd identify as an internal leader inside of that act. They would often be elevated to the status of being team captain. They would perhaps receive some extra remuneration for some coaching that they would perform. And inside of there, we had so much talent that we could see that somehow we weren't fostering to become head coaches within the company. And part of that is because they were stuck performing for us. So when we came time to hire coaches, we very proudly said, we're not just looking for an experienced performer, because being a great performer doesn't necessarily make you a great coach. We were looking for people with education, experience, and yet our internal people hadn't had the opportunity to get education because they had spent years on stage for us. They didn't have, experience coaching their national team because they were busy on stage for us. So we had provided a pathway to prepare them to be able to speak even with our other members of our integrated services team. We needed coaches who could talk to our performance medicine staff on an equal footing. And we hadn't been preparing our coaches to do that. So that's when we started this. We first changed the job title. We stopped calling them captains, and we started calling them artist coaches. That was our first step. And then our next step was to say, okay, they are now coaches inside of the company. So we need to provide them professional development. so that we could start moving them along the pathway. And that's when we started creating these modules. With the first one that I liked to deliver, but I'll tell you, we had a real problem with our delivery, and I was the problem with the delivery. Now that I reflect on it, my problem with the delivery was that I didn't believe in online learning at all or blended. I wanted to do everything in person, deliver some theory, but then go on stage with the coaches and be in the environment with them myself and ask them questions about what they were doing and reflect on it after. And this was the idea. It was our company was too big and I was one person and it was slow and cumbersome. So I was the problem. But the first module we delivered to them was it was a book. It was on leadership. So the first thing we sent to our now artist coaches, our formerly captains, was we delivered a module to them on leadership, and it was based in large part, at least inspired by a book called The Captain's Class by Sam Walker. I don't know if you read that.
No.
Super good. I went to an event called Leaders in Sport 5 years ago, and he was a speaker at the event, and he was presenting on his book, The Captain's Class, and it wasn't out yet, but before it had even finished, I got on Amazon and saw the date it was coming out, and I had ordered his book before it had even finished because it was really inspiring what he was speaking of. The idea behind The Captain's Class is that you can take a look at great sports teams. He starts by saying what the greatest sports teams in the world are. And he looked at ELO ratings and all different things, and he tried to objectively say what are the greatest teams in the world, in the history of the world. It goes back to the Collingwood Magpies 100 years ago in Australian rules football was one of the greatest teams ever. So it's really like he really goes in depth with how he decides who these great sports teams are. But then he said once he had made the list, that was the original goal, was what are the greatest sports teams ever. Once he did that, he said, well, there's probably something rich here. I want to dig deeper and figure out what made these teams great. Was it, they must have had a great coach. And he found that some of them did. The San Antonio Spurs were on the list, and they had Popovich. So, okay, look, the teams need a great coach, and a great coach is what makes them great. And then he dug deeper, and he found that other teams were going through an era of dominance, and then the coach got fired, and a new coach came in, and the era of dominance continued. And so it wasn't the coach that was leading to that. We said it has to be big money. Some of these teams must have huge money. Well, if that was it, maybe the New York Yankees should win every year. And well, that didn't happen either. So it was some teams had money, you look at Barcelona football and said, okay, they have deep pockets. So some teams have deep pockets and they hire the best players, yet others succeed despite some financial difficulties. So he kept digging and digging, and he was trying to figure out anything that connected to all of these. And he found that all of these teams had an era of dominance that started when one player arrived and finished when that player left. And that player wasn't necessarily a GOAT. They weren't necessarily Michael Jordan. Some of them were very average players. He even makes a point of showing how some of them were even maybe below average players, lucky to be on the team. Or he referenced Fernando Bernini, I think was his name. He was a Brazilian soccer player in the era of Pele, and the Pele was never the captain of the team, but this guy Bernini was. So he found that in every single case, these eras of dominance started when one player arrived, finished when that player left. That player wasn't necessarily the star, or he might have been. And in every case, that player eventually became the captain of the team, either voted on by his teammates or nominated such by the team or club management. And so then he said, okay, now I've discovered something super cool here. I'm going to figure out if these team captains, had traits in common. And then he goes into things like the Ringelmann effect and things like that, where these players would lead through examples of great emotion and not giving up, and that would inspire their team. And he goes through all these qualities that these captains had that made them great leaders. So the punchline of the book is really leading by example. and it's sort of intended not for sports people. It's written just as a leadership book so that you could give it to somebody in business and it would say, here's a good way to manage a team and to be a good manager. But we used that and made a parallel between this and the circus as well. So that was our first chapter on that we developed to our new coaches. It told them how important they are to us. You guys, there's one of you from each act in the show, so that these 4, 6, 8 of you guys are the backbone of the show. And if you let down, then the whole show goes down. And if you elevate yourself, we're all going to be elevated. So that let them know how important they were to us. And it also let them know why we were now investing in them, because we believed in succession planning and we believed that they were going to be the future head coaches of the company. So then we started creating other modules, like I said, the mental performance one that Hatters wrote. Dave Hadfield wrote us 3 mental performance modules. A guy named Keith Russell did a biomechanics, board heavily on him for a biomechanics module. The teaching and learning module I put together, but I stood on everyone else's shoulders to do it. I just stole great ideas and put them together in a module. And then we started delivering these to our artists who are been our artist coaches. And we can see, I don't actually have the number now. Actually, now there's not many shows running now thanks to COVID. But I can tell you, we definitely saw results of many success stories where I can go, that artist of ours is now one of our head coaches. That artist of ours is now one of our head coaches. And now I can go down a list of names and go, look at the success stories we've had. We still hire externally. We hired a girl named Cherie Walker. She's a PhD in biomechanics and super talented coach from Australia. We hired her in because we see, oh my God, you're a great fit for us. And we want to continue to bring in external knowledge into the company as well. But if I was going to pick a number, I'd say I want 80% of our coaches to be internally developed talent and 20% of our head coaches to come from completely outside, so we continue to bring in great people, fresh ideas, top coaches from who don't have any background in the circus. We've actually even hired people from alpine skiing to coach inside the company, who have and they with work and they learned to become successful in our environment because they had something valuable to bring in. So the idea is, if you think of it, our head coaches are almost like performance directors, and maybe you don't have to be. You could bring in a performance director from a different sport, and they could still succeed in your environment. So we've had some successes bringing in people from the outside completely, but that's not where the majority of our people come from. That was a long ramble. I hope I did even answer your question. I even lost the question.
It did, and it was kind of the coach development process for you, and what do we need to learn in sports to do that. It's interesting because I was thinking while you were talking about that, about academic institutions, and there's in many places either a written or unwritten policy of we don't hire our own, and here you are showing that maybe that's the wrong attitude to take. Maybe this is the opportunity where we hire our own because we can develop them the way that we need them to be successful.
Exactly.
So I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail and get into academics. Matthew, I want to be respectful of your time. If people have questions and want to reach out, what's the best way for them to do that?
You have my email address. You can just put it out for people, and there it is there.
It's matthew.sparks@cirquedusoleil.com.
Yep.
Matthew, thank you so much. Of course, I fully enjoyed meeting you last year, and I'm so thankful that you're willing to take some time today and talk with me a little bit about performance coaching. The interesting thing for me is just the corollaries across the sports and artistic worlds. And when you talk, I can just see athletes at the same time experiencing these same emotions, these same pressures, etc. So it's fascinating just to see so much crossover between these two worlds.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you for your time.
Well, just a reminder, I did post earlier this week when we advertised Matthew being on the stream that I was going to give away a t-shirt. and I did a little drawing, and I've got a graphic here. And let me just get rid of Matthew's email address before I randomly chosen. Here we go. It came down to Tim Reich for Chris Hobbs. Chris, you just squeaked it, my friend. So I'm going to reach out to you, find out your shirt size, and happy to send you a shirt. Thanks for being part of that competition. Thank you also for joining us. My thanks to Matthew Sparks, and of course, on behalf of myself, Tim Backhurst. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.